I stood in line with a woman whose coat brushed my arm, whose voice I can still hear. Minutes later, a guard asked me a single question, and that was when I realized no one else remembered she had ever been there. We arrived just before closing, when the building felt hollow and the light had gone thin and gray. It was a place meant for order and records, not confusion or loss, and yet something about the air felt unsettled from the start. I thought we were there to finish a simple process and leave, unaware that the silence around us was already rearranging itself. The woman stood beside me, close enough that our coats brushed when the line crept forward an inch and then stopped again. She hadn't taken her coat off, even though the room was warm in that stale, recycled way buildings get when they're trying too hard to be neutral. Her hands were folded at her waist, fingers wrapped together like she was keeping something from slipping out. I noticed her knuckles were pale. Not tense exactly, just careful. I remember thinking she looked like someone who didn't want to be noticed. The guard at the far end of the room called out a name. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It always does in rooms like that. Names echoed longer than they should, hanging in the air for a second before dropping flat to the floor. A man stepped out of the line, nodded once, and disappeared through a door that didn't bother pretending to be welcoming. We waited. The woman shifted her weight, the heel of her shoe scraping softly against the floor. The sound felt too loud. She glanced at the clock, then back down at her hands. "Do you know if this line moves faster near the end?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not shy, just low, like she didn't want to disturb anything already settled. "I don't think so," I said. "Feels the same all the way through." She nodded, as if that confirmed something she already suspected. The corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile. "I always forget how long these places make you wait," she said. I told her it was probably on purpose. She exhaled through her nose, a soft sound that might have been a laugh if she'd let it grow. Then she went still again, hands folded, eyes forward. The line moved, barely, enough to make everyone straighten, hopeful for half a second.
Attention.
Shoes slid,
Now
jackets rustled.
serving
Then it
A.
stopped
Garcia.
again. The clock kept ticking.
Please
I became aware of the
proceed
room
to
in
Window
fragments,
7.
the hum of the lights overhead. A paper sign taped crookedly to the wall, corners peeling. The faint smell of disinfectant layered over something older, like dust that had been scrubbed but never truly removed. Every few minutes, a guard's voice. A name. A pause. Footsteps fading. The woman beside me breathed slowly, evenly. Her coat was a dark color, blue,
Mr.
I think, though the lighting
Kasnabis,
flattened everything.
Your
I noticed a loose
appointment
thread near
is
her cuff.
ready at
I wondered if
window
she'd seen
4.
it. Another name was called. Not ours. She leaned slightly toward me, just enough to close the space again. "I hate the waiting," she said. "It makes everything feel heavier than it is." I agreed, though I wasn't sure that was true. Sometimes the waiting doesn't make things heavier. Sometimes it just makes you aware of the weight that was already there. She glanced at me then, really looked. Her eyes were tired but alert, like she'd learned to stay ready even when nothing seemed to be happening. "We'll be done soon," I said, not because I knew it, but because it felt like the right thing to offer. She nodded once. "Soon," she
Listen
repeated quietly.
closely
The line
to
crept
the
forward again,
silence,
this time more than
child.
before. 2 steps, enough to feel real.
It
Relief
has
loosened something in
much
my
to
chest,
tell
subtle but
you.
noticeable. Progress always does that, even when you don't know what you're progressing toward. I stepped forward and stopped. The woman followed, her coat brushing my arm again. Her hands stayed folded. The guard called another name. A woman farther up the line gathered her papers too quickly, dropping one. She knelt to pick it up, hands shaking. No one spoke. The woman beside me watched with a softness that surprised me. Not pity, recognition. "I've been on both sides of this," she said suddenly. "Waiting and being called." I turned to her. "Which is worse?" She thought about it. Really thought. "Waiting," she said, "because you don't know what version of yourself you'll be when it's your turn." The clock ticked. The line shifted again, just enough that we were almost at the front. I could see the counter now, the glass barrier with its narrow slot at the bottom. Stacks of paper. A chair bolted to the floor behind him. The clerk didn't look up. My name felt closer. Not called yet, just closer. I realized then that I didn't know the woman's name. It hadn't come up, and it felt strange, suddenly, how natural that seemed. We'd spoken, shared small truths, stood shoulder to shoulder through the slow inching of time. And yet there was nothing to tie her to me beyond this line, this room. I told myself it didn't matter. People pass through our lives like that all the time. Brief intersections, temporary nearness. Still, when the line moved again and I stepped forward, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't place. A thin unease, like when you reach for a railing that's always been there and find only air. I stopped, turned slightly, expecting to feel her coat brush my arm again. For a moment, everything was quiet except the clock, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already begun to loosen its grip. Something I wouldn't notice fully until it was gone. The glass at the counter was thick enough to dull reflections. When I leaned closer, my own face looked faded, like it belonged to someone waiting in another room. The narrow slot at the bottom of the glass sat at knee-height, dark inside, already worn smooth by years of passing paper back and forth. The clerk didn't look up when we reached the front. Her hands moved before her eyes did, sliding a stack of forms forward as if they were all the same. The woman beside me stepped closer without a word. I felt it before I saw it. The light brush of her coat against my arm, the warmth of another person standing just within reach. The room smelled faintly of toner and something older, like damp cardboard. The clock was quieter here, but I could still feel it counting. "Put your ID through the slot," the clerk said. Her voice was calm in a way that had learned not to be curious. I did as I was told. The plastic edge of my card scraped softly against metal. It disappeared, then returned with a small stamp pressed into one corner. The sound of it landing back on the counter was dull, funny. The woman leaned in, her shoulder nearly touching mine. She tilted her head to read the page the clerk had pushed forward. I could feel her breath through my sleeve, warm and steady, like she was concentrating hard on something small. "Is this where it says?" she asked, pointing at a line halfway down the page. The clerk glanced up for the first time. Just a glance. "That line's standard," she said. "Everyone signs there." The woman nodded slowly, not fully convinced. She traced the sentence with her finger, reading it again. Her nail tapped lightly at the end, once, twice. "I don't remember this part," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. The clerk shrugged. Not unkindly, just practiced. "It's always been there." I watched the woman's face as she listened. There was no panic in it, just a careful stillness, like she was trying to decide whether something was worth questioning or not. She exhaled and lowered her hand. "Okay," she said. The clerk slid the paper toward me. "Sign and date." The pen was attached to the counter with a thin metal chain. It felt heavier than it needed to be. I didn't read the page the way I should have. I skimmed it the way people do when they trust the room they're in, the system behind the glass. My name looked strange when I wrote it, like it didn't quite fit the space provided. I signed, dated, pushed the paper through the slot. The clerk took it, stacked it neatly with the others, and pulled out a new page without comment. The rhythm was smooth, uninterrupted. She could have been dealing cards. "Next," she said. I stepped slightly to the side to make room. Just a small movement. A habit. The space beside me felt wrong immediately. Not empty exactly, just colder, like the warmth that had been there a moment ago had been switched off instead of fading. I assumed the woman had stepped back to check something, or maybe leaned away to let me finish. I didn't turn right away. I waited for the brush of her coat again. It didn't come. The clerk slid another form toward the glass. "You'll need this as well." I took it automatically. My eyes flicked sideways then, expecting to see the woman already reading, her head tilted in that careful way. There was no one there, just the counter edge and the pale wall beyond it. I stepped back another inch. "Sorry," I said quietly, thinking I'd blocked her view. No answer. Behind us, the line shifted. Shoes scuffed. Someone coughed. The air moved, but not the way it had before. I turned fully then. The woman was not standing there. I scanned the small space around the counter, the way people do when they've misplaced something, and expect it to appear if they look hard enough. She wasn't to my left, not behind me. The place where she'd stood felt marked somehow, like the floor still remembered the shape of her shoes. "Do you need help with that form?" the clerk asked. Her voice pulled me back. I stopped. The word hung there, unfinished. I was with someone. The clerk looked past me, eyes skimming the line, the room. She didn't linger on any face. "If they stepped away, they'll need to rejoin the line," she said. The words were simple, reasonable. "I don't think she stepped away," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure what I meant. The clerk's expression didn't change. "We can't hold a place." I nodded, even though my chest felt tight. I folded the new form in my hands, creasing it without meaning to. The paper made a soft, brittle sound. I waited. A few seconds, then longer. Nothing. The line behind me pressed forward gently, not unkindly, just following the rules of movement. Someone's elbow brushed my back. I moved aside to let them through, stepping into the space the woman had left. It was colder there. I noticed it again, sharper this time. I finished my part at the counter in a blur. More paper. Another signature. A stamped date. The clerk slid my documents back to me, already reaching for the next stack. "All set," she said. I gathered my things and stepped away from the glass. The room opened up in front of me, wide and indifferent. I looked for the woman near the wall, near the chairs, near the door. I told myself she must have gone ahead, or back, or somewhere just out of frame. But the quiet felt different now. Heavier. As I stood there holding my papers, the edge of one page caught the light just right, and I realized how easily a person could move through this place without leaving anything behind. No sound. No question. Just a moment of warmth beside you, and then the space where it had been. I folded the papers carefully and waited, listening for my name, wondering when I'd last felt someone's breath against my sleeve without thinking to hold on to it. The chair sat against the wall like it had been left mid-thought. Not pushed in. Not abandoned either. Just angled forward, one back leg slightly out of line, as if someone had stood up in a hurry and meant to return. The metal frame caught the light in a dull way. The kind that only happens after years of hands and coats and quiet waiting. I noticed it because it didn't belong to the stillness around it. I told myself it was nothing. Rooms like this collect half moments. People rise, sit, shift, leave things behind for a minute. A purse under a chair. A jacket slung over an armrest. The idea that someone would step away and come back felt ordinary enough to rest on. So I let it. The wall behind the chair was scuffed at shoulder height, paint rubbed thin by bodies leaning back over time. A posted notice curled at the corners. The air hummed, not loud, not silent. Just alive enough to remind you it was shared. I stood there holding my papers, the edges already soft from my hands. The glass counter was behind me now. Ahead of me, the room stretched into a shallow rectangle of waiting. The clock kept time with its small insistence. The guard's voice rose now and then, calling names like stones dropped into water. I shifted my weight and waited. A man a few steps away cleared his throat and immediately seemed embarrassed by it. Someone else shuffled papers, too many pages for a simple task. Footsteps passed in the hall beyond the door, distant and purposeful, then faded. I glanced at the chair again. It still leaned forward. The woman had stood there. I was sure of it. I could still feel the warmth of her presence, the way you feel heat after someone moves away from a fire. Not imagined. Not sentimental. Just physical memory. She probably stepped out, I told myself. The words stayed inside my mouth. Maybe the restroom. Maybe she'd been called aside for a question I didn't hear. These places love side doors and quiet corrections. I watched the doorway, expecting her to come back through it with that careful look on her face, coat still buttoned, hands folding themselves again. I imagined the small apology she'd give, not because she owed one, but because she was the kind of person who smoothed edges without being asked. Minutes passed. The chair did not move. I looked around more deliberately this time. Slowly. I scanned the line of people along the wall, then the cluster near the counter. I searched for the dark blue of her coat, the way she held herself slightly inward, like she didn't want to take up more room than necessary. Nothing. Faces blurred together in that way they do when you're searching for one and find only many. Different heights. Different shoes. Familiar gestures that belonged to strangers. No one was looking toward the chair. That was what unsettled me most. If someone leaves a thing behind, people notice. A bag. A seat. An open space where there shouldn't be one. Someone asks. Someone waits. Someone adjusts around it. Here, the room flowed as if the chair had always been empty. I took a step closer to it. Just one. The floor creaked faintly, the sound old and tired, like it remembered better days. I stood beside the chair now, close enough to see the faint indentation in the seat where weight had rested not long ago. The fabric was slightly darker there, still holding its shape. I touched the backrest with 2 fingers. It was cool. The realization came quietly. Not as fear. Not as panic. Just a small internal shift, like a shelf settling after you remove a book. She hadn't stepped away. I straightened and looked again. Faster this time, my eyes moved without patience now, tracing the edges of the room, the exits, the corners where people linger. I half expected her to appear the moment I admitted the thought, as if being named would pull her back into place. She didn't. A guard walked past me, not the one at the counter. Another. Younger. He adjusted his belt as he moved, gaze forward, already on his next task. He passed the chair without looking at it. I opened my mouth. Closed it. What would I say? That someone who had been here was no longer here? That I felt it in the cold space beside me? That a chair remembered a body the room had forgotten? The words felt thin even before they existed. The clock ticked. The sound pressed against my temples. Another name was called. Someone stood, brushed past the chair, and took the space beside it without hesitation. The empty place narrowed. The room rearranged itself around absence, as if it were nothing more than air. I stepped back. The person who'd moved into the space leaned against the wall, scrolling on their phone, weight shifting easily. The chair was nudged a fraction closer to the wall. Its angle corrected. The mark of her presence softened. I felt something tighten then. Not grief. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. Like realizing a sentence has ended without the punctuation you expected. I looked at the faces again, searching not just for her now, but for recognition. For someone else to pause. To hesitate. To glance at the chair the way I had. No one did. The room continued its low, mechanical life. Papers moved. Names were called. Doors opened and closed. The process went on, smooth and indifferent. I stood there holding my documents, suddenly unsure where to place myself. The space beside me was occupied now, but it felt wrong, like a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit. I wondered how long she had been gone. Seconds? Minutes? Long enough for the room to decide she had never mattered to its order. I folded my papers once. Then again. The creases were sharp. Somewhere inside me, a quiet question formed, one I didn't want to finish yet. Not here. Not without proof. I took a slow breath and waited, listening to the hum of the room, watching the chair settle fully into its place against the wall. Ordinary again, unremarkable, knowing that whatever had happened was not finished with me yet. Chapter title: The Guard's Question. The guard's shoes made almost no sound when he approached. That was the first thing I noticed. A soft rubber hush against the floor, like he had learned how not to interrupt rooms. I was staring at my documents when his shadow crossed them, stretching thin and long over the paper. The clock ticked once. Then again. I looked up because the silence told me to. He didn't smile. He didn't frown either. His face was settled into something practiced, something neutral enough to hold any outcome. He glanced down at the papers in my hands, then back at me, as if checking that the two things matched. His eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Did you come in alone today?" he asked. The question landed softly. Too softly for what it carried. For a second, my mouth answered before my mind did. "No," I said. The word came out clean, certain. "I was with someone." The guard nodded once, slowly, as if that response fit into a familiar shape. He didn't write anything down. He didn't reach for a radio. He just waited. I could hear the clock again now. Every tick sounded closer, louder, like it had moved nearer while I wasn't looking. The walls felt closer too. The room hadn't changed, but something about my place in it had. "She was right here," I added, because the quiet felt too open without proof. I gestured to the space beside me, to the place that had already been filled and emptied and forgotten. We were together in line. The guard's gaze followed my hand, then returned to my face. His expression didn't shift. If anything, it softened slightly, the way people look when they already know the end of the story but are required to listen anyway. "What's her name?" he asked. I opened my mouth. Nothing came. The pause stretched. Not long. Just long enough to make itself known. I felt heat rise to my ears, a quiet embarrassment for a mistake I didn't yet understand. I searched my memory, certain the name was there, waiting to be retrieved. We hadn't shared it. I swallowed. She didn't say, I admitted. We were just waiting together. The guard nodded again. He looked back at my papers, flipping the top page with a careful finger. The sound of it turning felt too loud, too deliberate. "She wasn't checked in," he said, not accusing, just stating. "There's no record of anyone matching that description entering with you." "That can't be right," I said. The words came faster now, pushing against the calm. "She was at the counter with me." She leaned over the glass. She asked about a line on the form. I could still feel it. Her breath against my sleeve. The warmth of her coat. The slight tap of her nail on paper. The guard listened. Really listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. When I finished, he let the silence return, heavy and patient between us. "I believe you," he said quietly. That unsettled me more than doubt would have. He stepped half a pace closer, lowering his voice, as if the room didn't need to hear this part. "But there's no sign of her in the system. No intake. No temporary badge. Nothing logged." The word logged stayed with me, like something dropped and never picked up. I shook my head. The movement felt small, ineffective. "She didn't leave," I said. "She wouldn't have left without saying something." The guard glanced toward the chairs, the wall, the doorway. His eyes traced the room the way mine had earlier, except his search was slower, more final. "Sometimes people think they come in together," he said gently, "when they don't." The sentence sat between us, waiting to be accepted or refused. "That's not what this was," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I spoke to her. We waited. She was real. The guard studied me for a moment longer. I noticed then how still he stood, how grounded. He had the posture of someone used to delivering answers that didn't comfort. He asked one more question, the one that would not let me back into the version of the room I had known before. "Did you see her check in?" The clock ticked. I pictured the counter, the slot, the papers moving back and forth. I pictured my own ID sliding under the glass. The stamp, the clerk's hands. I could not picture hers doing the same. "No," I said. The guard nodded, as if something had settled into place. He didn't look satisfied, just resolved. Then she was never officially here. The word officially made the room tilt slightly. I held my papers tighter, the edges biting into my palms. "But I remember her," I said. The sentence felt thin even to me, but it was all I had left. The guard's gaze softened again, but this time there was distance in it. "Memory doesn't always leave a trace," he said. "Not the kind we can find." He stepped back, giving the space back to me, as if that might help. The room breathed again. People moved. A name was called. Life continued, unbothered by my pause. "If you'd like to file a report," he added, "you can. But without identifying information, it may not go far." I nodded slowly. Filing something felt like trying to pin fog to a board. The guard waited a moment longer, then turned away. His shoes made that same soft sound as he left, barely disturbing the floor. I stood there after he was gone, the question still echoing in my ears, heavier now than when it was first asked. "Did you come in alone?" The walls did feel closer. Or maybe I was standing differently. Smaller somehow. I looked at the empty space beside me one more time. The place where a conversation had happened. Where warmth had been. Where a person had existed long enough to matter to me, and no one else. The clock ticked on, indifferent. I folded my papers carefully, smoothing the creases, grounding myself in something that could be held. As I turned toward the chairs, toward the door, toward whatever came next, one thought stayed with me, quiet and insistent. If the system had no record of her, and no one else noticed she was gone, then how many people pass through places like this every day, real to someone for a moment, and nowhere else at all? Chapter title: What Was Never Logged. The automatic doors opened with a tired sigh, the kind that sounded less like a welcome and more like permission to leave. Afternoon light spilled in from outside, pale and thinning, stretched long across the tiled floor. Dust hung in it, slow and deliberate, like it had nowhere else to be. I paused just inside the doorway, papers folded against my chest, listening to the room behind me continue without me. The clock kept ticking. The guard's voice called another name. Someone laughed softly, then stopped. I stepped forward, and the doors closed behind me with a sound too final for how small the moment was. It was only then, outside the weight of the room, that the details began to surface. Not all at once. They came the way cold does, gradually, until you realize you've been shivering for a while. She never showed her ID, not once. I replayed the counter in my mind, the narrow slot, the clerk's hands moving in practiced arcs. I remembered my card sliding under the glass, the dull stamp pressed into plastic. I remembered the sound of it coming back. But I could not remember the sound of hers. She never spoke her full name, I didn't even ask. We had stood close enough to share breath and warmth, but we stayed in the shallow end of things. Waiting line conversation. Weather. Time. The heaviness of buildings like that. Nothing that would anchor her to paper or ink. And the screen behind the glass. I saw my name appear there, pixel by pixel, block letters glowing faintly. I never saw hers. At the time, it hadn't seemed strange. Screens miss things. Systems lag. Clerks forget to look up. It was easier to believe that than to question the shape of the moment itself. I walked down the short concrete steps outside, the air cooler than I expected. The building loomed behind me, windowless on this side, a blank face that gave nothing away. Cars passed on the road, their tires whispering against asphalt. Somewhere, a bird called once and went quiet. I stopped near the curb and unfolded my papers. They were all there, stamped, signed, dated. Proof that I had existed in that place. I folded them again, slower this time, pressing the creases flat with my thumb. The paper resisted slightly, stiff with importance. I wondered what it would take for a person to leave no such resistance behind. The guard had already moved on. I knew that without turning back. He was doing his job, which meant closing doors as cleanly as possible. For him, the question had been answered. There was no record, no discrepancy worth holding open. Nothing unresolved. I didn't blame him. Systems aren't built to hold what can't be named. As I started toward the parking lot, her presence returned to me, not as an image, but as a series of small absences. The way she'd leaned in to read the form, careful not to touch the glass. The way her coat stayed buttoned, like she planned to leave quickly. The way she'd said waiting makes everything feel heavier and meant more than the line. I saw now what I hadn't then. She carried herself like someone used to passing through without friction. No demands. No declarations. Just enough shape to be human, not enough to be held. A shadow. Shadows don't need identification. They don't sign forms. They don't appear on screens. They cross floors quietly, borrowing light for a moment, then moving on when the angle changes. I reached my car and rested my hand on the roof. The metal was cool. Solid. Real in a way that steadied me. I stayed there longer than necessary, watching the building's reflection ripple faintly in the windshield. People went in, people came out. None of them were her. I tried to remember her face more clearly, but memory softened at the edges. Not erased, just unwilling to sharpen. Like it was protecting something fragile by keeping it vague. I wondered where she had gone after the counter. Whether she'd stepped back into the world with the same quiet she'd brought into that room. Whether there was another building, another line, another chair that still remembered her shape for a few minutes before forgetting. Or maybe this was the only place our paths had crossed. A brief overlap. Two lives brushing against each other without leaving evidence. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. The sound was reassuring. Contained. The kind of sound that says this is yours. Before starting the engine, I sat with my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of them. Feeling myself still here. The light outside had shifted again, the sun lowering enough to soften everything it touched. Long shadows stretched across the lot, crossing painted lines without permission. I watched one pass over my hood and disappear. No form recorded IT.no system acknowledged it. And yet I saw it. As I drove away, one thought stayed with me, steady and unresolved, like a stone carried in a pocket. Not all disappearances are loud. Not all losses announce themselves. Some people don't vanish because they are taken. They vanish because no one ever writes them down. And I wondered quietly, carefully, how many lives move through the world that way, real to someone for a moment, and nowhere else at all.